Good morning. Welcome on this beautiful fall day as we prepare for Thanksgiving coming up. And I'm Jim Harvin. I'll be your lay leader for today. And welcome. Welcome to this congregation where for over half a century we have been seeking to foster community, to grow our spirits, to serve others, and to work for justice. We are very glad that you have joined us this morning in our sacred cyberspace and hope that here you will experience love, acceptance, and inspiration. After our service, please feel welcome to stick around for fellowship and conversation. Our annual theme this year through Touchstones is Repairing the World, and our November topic is Nonviolence. Going back to Thoreau on our Unitarian side and Reverend Adin Ballou on the Universalist side, there has been an abiding appreciation of the importance of nonviolent resistance in our UU congregations. A commitment to nonviolence is essential to oppose and subvert a culture of violence that is so damaging. Nonviolence is an essential tool in the work to repair the world. Today's sermon is from Emily Quarles-Mowrer. She is the child of a UU minister and has been preaching sermons of her own since 2006 and has been a past guest speaker for us for several years. She currently lives in Gilbertsville, Pennsylvania with her husband, her 2 daughters, 4 cats, and 1 very outnumbered dog. And her sermon for today is The Other Ballou. We hear a lot about Hosea Ballou, the Universalist writer, and about his grand-nephew, Hosea Ballou II, the first president of Tufts University. But how much do we know about Adin Ballou, the abolitionist founder of the Hopewell Community in Massachusetts? Adin Ballou's writings inspired famous writer Leo Tolstoy, but he did not just write about his beliefs, he also lived them. Join us as we learn about the lesser-known Ballou. And now let us enter into worship together. We're blessed to have Avi Wisnia as our musician, and he will now do our prelude.
Good morning. We start with a song by a good friend of mine, local songwriter Aaron Nathans, who wrote a song about a famous baseball player who showed us all the strength to not fight back. You know why we brought you here, he bellowed with a gleam. You're here to play in Brooklyn. You can make the team. I know that you can hit the ball, but there's more to discuss. What I need to know from you is if you have the guts. When they bring the scorn upon you, you'll have to turn the other cheek. You need to stand your ground in silence up against the highest heat. If you lose your head, they've got you, so this will be our pact. I need to know that you have got the strength to not fight back. He stood into the batter's box and took what they could throw, a fastball to the head and reminders of Jim Crow. They spiked him on the base paths, they cursed him from the stands, and even his own manager said he was half a man. But his hitting was electric, he ran in no time flat. He heard all of the taunting and he answered with his bat. It's a hard road to travel and he didn't draw the map. Stood in a long line of those with strength to not fight back. From a man who held a bullhorn on the streets of the Castro, to Mahatma's march in India and Kent State, Ohio, to a jail cell in South Africa where a man learned to forgive, to a lunch counter in Greensboro and the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Washington astride a sea of men. 2 lessons of humility from a man from Bethlehem. He said to love your neighbors and forgive those who attack. And as he died, he showed he had the strength to not fight back. Oh, the strength to not fight back against a vicious fist. The strength to not fight back and the power to resist. When they laughed at him or froze them out, or when they brushed them back, somehow inside they all find the strength to not fight back. So we're at a crossroads, we stand there every day. Can we check our pride, or must we escalate with a neighbor or a co-worker, a policeman or a clerk, or when somebody cuts us off when we're driving home from work? Jackie, how'd you do it? How'd you turn the other cheek? When you felt the rage swell up, you never said a peep. By power of example, you more than kept your pact. You showed us all how to find the strength to not fight back. Oh, the strength to not fight back, to stand the higher ground. The strength to not fight back, to speak without a sound. When they laugh at us or freeze us out, or when they brush us back, somehow inside we can find the strength to not fight back. Somehow inside we can find the strength to not fight back.
Thank you, Avi. That was a wonderful song about a contemporary hero that really exemplifies the theme for today. Our chalice lighting is, please repeat or say along with me, the chalice lighting, and they are, let there be light, let it shine in dark places, in moments of pain, in times of grief, in the darkness of hatred, violence, oppression, where there is discouragement and despair, wherever darkness is to be put to flight, let there be light. Our opening words are from Martin Luther King Jr. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. And now, Beck Stow, our religious exploration coordinator, will provide us with a story we've probably heard more than once, but bears repeating.
Good morning. My name is Beck Stow, and our story for all ages today is the classic fable Stone Soup, retold and illustrated by John J. Muth. 3 monks, Hawk, Lock, and So, traveled along the mountain road. They talked about cat whiskers, the color of the sun, and giving. What makes one happy, So? Asked Hawk, the youngest monk. Old So, who was the wisest, said, let's find out. The sound of a bell brought their gaze to the rooftops of a village below. They could not see from so high above that the village had been through many hard times. Famine, floods, and war had made the villagers weary and untrusting of strangers. They had even become suspicious of their neighbors. The villagers worked hard, but only for themselves. There was a farmer, a tea merchant, a scholar, a seamstress, a doctor, a carpenter, and many others, but they had little to do with one another. When the monks reached the foot of the mountain, the villagers disappeared into their houses. No one came to greet them at the gates. And when the people saw them enter the village, they closed their windows tight. The monks knocked on the door of the first house, and there was no answer. Then the house went dark. They knocked on a second door, and the same thing happened. It happened again and again from one house to the next. These people do not know happiness, they all agreed. But today, said So, his face bright as the moon, we will show them how to make stone soup. They gathered twigs and branches and made a fire. They placed a small tin pot on top and filled it with water from the village well. A brave little girl who had been watching them came to ask, "What are you doing?" "We are gathering twigs," said Locke. "We are making a fire," said Hawk. "We are making stone soup, and we need 3 round, smooth stones," said So. The little girl helped the monks look around the courtyard until they found just the right ones. They put them in the water to cook. "These stones will make excellent soup," said Sue. "But this very small pot won't make much, I'm afraid." "My mother has a bigger pot," said the girl. The little girl ran home and she started to take the pot. Her mother asked her what she was doing. "The 3 strangers are making soup from stones," she said. "They need our biggest pot." Said the girl's mother. "Stones are easy to come by. I'd like to know how to do that." The monks poked the coals. As smoke drifted up, the neighbors peered out from their windows. The fire and the large pot in the middle of the village was a true curiosity. One by one, the people of the village came out to see just what this stone soup was. Of course, old-style stone soup should be well seasoned with salt and pepper, said Hawk. "That is true," said Locke as he stirred the giant pot filled with water and stones, "but we have none." "I have some salt and pepper," said the scholar, his eyes big with curiosity. He disappeared and came back with salt and pepper and even a few other spices. So took a taste. "The last time we had soup, stones of this size and color, carrots made a very sweet broth." "Carrots," said a woman from the back. "I may have a few carrots, but just a few," and she ran off. She soon returned with as many carrots as she could carry and dropped them into the pot. "Do you think it would be better with onions?" asked Hawk. "Oh, yes, maybe an onion would taste good," said a farmer, and he hurried off. He returned in a moment with 5 big onions, and he dropped them into the bubbling soup. "Now that is a fine soup," he said. The villagers all nodded their heads, as the smell was very agreeable. "But if only we had some mushrooms," said So, rubbing his chin. Several villagers licked their lips. A few dashed away and returned with fresh mushrooms and noodles, pea pods, and cabbages. At last the soup was ready. The villagers gathered together and they brought rice and steamed buns. They brought lychee nuts and sweet cakes. They brought tea to drink and they lit lanterns. Everyone sat down to eat. They had not been together for a feast like this for as long as anyone could remember. After the banquet, they told stories and sang songs and celebrated long into the night. They had unlocked their doors and took the monks into their homes and given them very comfortable places to sleep. In the gentle spring morning, everyone gathered together near the walls to say farewell. "Thank you for having us as your guests," said the monks. "You have been most generous." "Thank you," said the villagers. "With the gifts you have given, we will always have plenty. You have shown us that sharing makes us all richer. And to think," said the monks, "to be happy is as simple as making stone soup."
Thank you, Bex. And now Avi will sing and play the interlude, which is a John Lennon tune.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine there's no possession. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You can say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will live as one.
Thank you, Avi. And now Emily will provide the reading for today.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, that was so beautiful, Avi's song. So my reading this morning is, it's by Adin Ballou, and it is for an address that he delivered at the anti-slavery picnic in 1843. I'm not going to read the whole address, but just a section. Justice is justice, and wrong is wrong, between men of all countries, complexions, and conditions alike. As ye would that others should do unto you, do ye even so unto them, is the golden rule for all human beings. By this rule, we must measure the justice of man to man and determine the right or wrong of his actions. You can tell it was written in the 1800s because there is no such thing as gender-neutral language. It is usual for our 4th of July orators to glorify liberty as the especial birthright of the American white men, while they overlook the condition of American colored men. To denounce British slavery, oppression, and tyranny, while they are silent concerning American slavery, oppression, and tyranny. To flatter their own countrymen with bombastic encomiums on their devotion to liberty and the excellence of their Republican institutions, instead of faithfully reproving them for their systemic violations of all their professed principles. It is time to be ashamed of this self-glorification and to consider that an ounce of genuine reform is better than tons of panegyric. We honor liberty only when we make her impartial, the same for and to all men. We honor the memory of our patriot fathers only when we are faithful to carry out their highest professions. We are the friends of all really good institutions when we disfellowship and endeavor to abolish those bad institutions which have grown up on the same soil. Even the good tree must be pruned that it may bring forth still more fruit. It is a pitiful weakness to crave perpetual flattery and to be offended at wholesome reproof. We Americans have exhibited enough of this weakness. We have lived on flattery long enough. We have been children long enough. We have been wheedled and befooled long enough by the sops and sugar plums of demagogues. It is time to know our own faults, to understand our own diseases, to repent our sins and put away our reproach. To do this is to be wise, to be honorable, to be happy. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is reproach to any people. The only government that can honor the wants of man is one founded in the moral sense of the people, sustained by an enlightened public conscience. And no political institutions, however specious in profession or sacred in the veneration of the multitude, can endure if erected on the sandy foundation of injustice and hypocrisy. Yet it shocks many people to hear the least intimation that the fundamental laws of our country are false and unjust in any important respects, that they need and must receive essential amendments in order to conform them to the law of God. They take a man for a public enemy, or at least a harebrained fanatic, who tells them that the Constitution of the United States, so far as it is in league to uphold Negro slavery, is in league to commit sin against God, man, and the self-evident truths of the national creed. They look on such a man as the defamer of his forefathers, the slanderer of republicanism, and virtually a traitor to government. And yet, what candid man can deny that this is the sober truth? If I hold it to be so, do I vilify the memory of our patriot forefathers? Do I give them no honor? Do I allow them no credit? I honor them with all my heart for their devotion to right principles, for the truly noble traits in their character, for their fidelity to their own highest light. But because I honor their love of liberty, must I honor their compromises with slavery? Must I worship their weaknesses? Must I hallow their errors? Or must I renounce all power to judge and determine what is right, implicitly consenting and obliging myself to all that they judged expedient? The Constitution of the United States, am I obliged to place it above Christianity and above the laws of Jehovah? May I not approve what is right in it without sanctifying what is wrong? Because I admire a handsome face, must I also admire the cancer on it, which I see beginning to eat away its beauty? I stand on a higher platform than any mere human compact. I try all human constitutions and laws by the criterion of divine law, by those great fundamental principles of moral rectitude which are coeval with God himself and which can never be violated without subverting the welfare of creation. Here we plant our feet, and here we assume to reject and denounce all the works of iniquity, whenever, in whomsoever exhibited. Washington, Adams, Hancock, and their patriot compeers stand before this judgment seat on the same level with Benedict Arnold, Aaron Burr, and the meanest of mankind. The right and the noble, the good and true shall here be honored, the wrong and base, the vile and false be condemned. Persons are here put to second principles, names and forms to things. At the same bar we try the Constitution of the United States and the British Charter. Right is right and wrong is wrong in spite of human opinions, customs, constitutions, and governments. And the man that does not take this sublime position is unfit to expound human duty or guide mankind into happiness. For if the blind leadeth the blind, both will fall into the ditch together.
Thank you, Emily. Those words still ring true today, unfortunately. And now we'll have our offertory. The split plate recipient for the month of November is the League of Women Voters of Bucks County, which never supports or opposes candidates for office or political parties. Elections and voting are core concerns for the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Please be generous. And now we welcome back Emily for her sermon.
So, the other Ballou. My title this morning was actually inspired by Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. You know, Dasher and Dancer and Prancer and Vixen. But of course, when we recall the most famous Ballou of all, it's not actually Adin Ballou. That honor would probably go to his uncle at a couple of removes, the 18th century writer and thinker Hosea Ballou, or possibly to Adin's illustrious distant cousin, the first president of Tufts University, Hosea Ballou II. But today, we are talking about the social reformer, Adin Ballou. First, a little background on Adin Ballou, courtesy of the Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biography, an online resource of the Unitarian Universalist History and Heritage Society. Adin Ballou's biography was written by Peter Hughes in December of 2000, and I'm going to hit the highlights here. So Adin Ballou was born in Cumberland, Rhode Island in 1803. Adin felt a call to ministry and asked to be allowed to go to college, but his father wanted him to take over the family farm, so Adin preached at local churches while continuing to work in his deceased elder brother's place on the farm. In 1822, Adin married Abigail Sales, whose mother was a Universalist. His mother-in-law introduced him to Universalist writings, and after reading and debating theology with some of his Universalist neighbors, Adin began attending Universalist meetings. And at a Universalist meeting in Rentham, Massachusetts, Adin met his distant cousin, Hosea Ballou II, who encouraged him to seek Universalist fellowship. When Adin announced that he was going to convert to Universalism, he was disinherited by his father, which made it so that he didn't have to work the farm anymore. So what good luck, what bad luck there. Adin visited Hosea Ballou II, as well as Hosea Ballou, the original, in Boston area for a time, and then moved nearer to his family farm and began preaching at local Universalist meetings. He was eventually ordained in 1824, and in case you haven't been doing the math, Ballou would have been just 21 when he was ordained. Adin's wife Abigail died in 1829 after the birth of their daughter Abby, and a few months later Adin became gravely ill that same year, and he was nursed back to health by a prominent member of a prominent family in his church, Lucy Hunt, who he later married, and his cousin Hosea II performed the ceremony. While visiting his cousin Hosea, Adin was introduced to a theological debate called the Restorationist controversy. Now, all Universalists believed that God's limitless love would allow no soul to be cast into eternal torment. However, there was a debate as to whether there was any torment. So Hosea Ballou, the elder, was of the opinion that punishment was not a part of God's plan. Adin Ballou, unlike John Letton, however, felt that he was a restorationist. He felt that there is a case backed by scripture that punishment does exist. However, that punishment is not eternal. In his 1830s sermon, The Inestimable Value of Souls, he says, "They shall be cast into a furnace of fire where shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." True. But nothing is here said concerning how long they shall remain there. The fire certainly existed before they were cast into it, or they could not have been cast into it. It was just as unquenchable before they were cast into it as while they were actually in it, and should they come out of it, it would be the same fire still. I think it's funny that he actually had a sense of humor, and it comes through in his writings. In 1841, Adin and his wife Lucy, as well as another couple, Ebenezer and Anna Draper, purchased a farm in western Milford, which they called the Hopewell Community. And in this experimental community, they hoped to govern with what they called Christian socialism, which was governing based upon love rather than upon fear. In the Hopedale community, everyone was treated as equals. In fact, Lucy became very prominent. She actually was the caretaker of the community while Adin did his traveling around. In 1846, Ballou published his work on pacifism, Christian non-resistance, while making anti-slavery lecture tours of the kind that I read earlier in Pennsylvania. And although Ballou was a firm abolitionist, he did not support the use of violence in ending slavery. The Hopewell Community went on to collapse as a socialist experiment in 1856, when the Drapers, who were founders, pulled their funding and converted the industrial operations into a private company. However, Hopedale remained an independent religious collective until 1867, when it became a Unitarian church. And Ballou remained the pastor of that church until 1880, when he retired. And after he retired, he spent his time on writing and correspondence, where he added to his already voluminous publishings the history of the Ballou family in America, the history of Hopedale, and his autobiography. And it was during this period that he most famously exchanged letters with the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who had his works translated into Russian. Ballou died in 1890, 10 years after retiring from the pulpit. So that's a little bit about his life. And clearly, Adin Ballou was a great thinker. Something I find really interesting was that you can read in his writings that he took his examples from all over, from writings from all over, and that he was, even though he was a firm Christian in faith, he did not believe that there was no such thing as other faiths with divine influence. He believed that all faiths had divine influence. He also was a follower of science, although the research that interested him most was usually dismissed today as pseudoscience. He really liked phrenology, for example. So the work that has the most in common with this month's theme of nonviolence is his 1836 work, Christian Non-Resistance. Ballou starts this work by speaking about different forms of non-resistance, including philosophical non-resistance, which is non-resistance that's spoken of in science or in other non-Christian theologies. Sentimental non-resistance, which is non-resistance arriving from the internal feelings, although this one was not particularly clearly delineated. And then there's the one that he wanted to focus on, which is necessitous non-resistance, which he says is preached by despots to their subjects, as well as by worldly outsiders to the victims of oppression. So necessitous non-resistance isn't actually non-resistance in his book. What he's saying with necessitous non-resistance is that's just where somebody knows that they can't prevail yet, and they are waiting and abiding and enduring under terrible circumstances until they can rise up with the force of arms to prevail with their own point of view. When Ballou talks about non-resistance, his definition can be distilled to a single Bible verse. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 41, so maybe not a single one. I'm quoting from the New International Version rather than King James Version that he quoted because it's easier to read this way. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. What Ballou took from this chapter and verse is that it's God's will that we replace reactivity and revenge, that tit-for-tat mentality of exchanging injury for injury or waiting until you have the force of arms to get your way, with the gentle nature displayed by Jesus. He called it non-resistance of injury with injury. In fact, he speaks of non-resistance in much the same way that we were examining the concept of acceptance earlier this year. Just as acceptance is not passively bearing with your circumstances, however good or bad they may be, non-resistance is not merely tolerating the abuses that others may heap upon you. He makes a few distinctions. First of all, that moral resistance is necessary. So non-resistance is purely physical non-resistance and not condoning actions that are what he calls evil. One must recognize and resist evil in oneself and must not condone the evils of others. Also, he believed in something that he called non-injurious, benevolent physical force. So he did recognize that sometimes people have to be restrained so that they don't do harm to themselves or others. The examples he gave were if a child is having a tantrum and kicking and biting people, well, keeping the child physically from kicking and biting people, that's not going to break your pacifism. That's just, keeping a child from hurting themselves and hurting others. And keeping someone from injury, preventing injury, is a benefit. It's a good and not an evil. Now, the fact that he carved out these caveats, some people took that to make the whole thing untenable. And what he says is, well, that's no more untenable than carving out caveats in temperance. Adin Ballou was a big supporter of the temperance movement. He believed that imbibing alcohol caused moral ills. Yet, he acknowledged that many medicines of the era, both those to be used externally and those to be used internally, were compounded using alcohol. So objectors to the temperance movement would say, well, if you are using this particular medicine under a doctor's supervision, even like externally or internally, well, then you're not a temperate. You don't believe in temperance. The modern equivalent to that would be equating somebody who takes prescribed painkillers after surgery, exactly as directed by their physician, as having substance use disorder because they're taking this particular substance. There's a clear distinction there, both in the intent and in the use, and it's the same as what Ballou describes. So Ballou takes his ideas from scripture, and in his writings, he seeks to head off his rebuttals, people who would like to tell him that he's wrong. He likes to head them off at the pass. And one of the things that people would put forward to say that he was wrong was that, well, when Jesus said that we should, I'm going to run back, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but don't resist that evil person. Well, when Jesus said that, what he was actually saying was that, really it should be the government meting out these punishments, and you shouldn't be pursuing personal revenge. And what Ballou writes to that is, well, Jesus did not say, ye have heard that it hath been said, let every man take vengeance on his own offender and redress his own grievances. But I say to you, look to the government and complain to the magistrates and carry all your causes into the court for adjudication. I laughed when I read this because that seems to be what we do now. Yes, look to the government and complain to the school board. Another rebuttal that people came up with was that Jesus was saying, oh, well, we don't want you to use the laws, the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, in a spirit of vengeance. We just want to make sure that we're using the law in the right spirit. And what Ballou says of the ways that the law is practiced then, and kind of still sounds like it's practiced still, is he describes these laws as, keep your distance, touch not my property, insult not my honor, infringe not my rights, assail not my person, be just and respectful, yield to my convenience and be my friend, or I will let slip the dogs of war and you shall feel the weight of my vengeance. I will inflict unendurable injuries on you, death, torture, imprisonment, pains, penalties. I will do you incomparably greater evil than you can do me. Therefore, be afraid and let me alone. That sounds a little bit like the penal code in our country. And people who argue that the penal code in our country is enacted even-handedly and without vengeance or who believe that laws act as a deterrent against crime should perhaps be watching the news more frequently. And maybe they should acquaint themselves with the writings of Adin Ballou. Our penal code is set up on what Ballou called the grim and bloody god of human injury. Now, on the other hand, we have alternatives that we have set up. When we think about restorative justice, then we are moving forward with the ideas that Ballou promoted. This doctrine that he promoted of meeting evil with love, it can be seen in the Buddhist story of the thief and the master, just as well as in this story that he included as an illustration that one need not act with fear and inflict injury in order to resist injury. And if you're familiar with the thief and the master, this story will sound very similar. The story was collected from Fowler's Phrenological Journal, and I've condensed it here slightly. The Reverend John Pomfret, an English Methodist minister, was accosted by a robber, demanding his money and threatening his life if he refused. The Reverend Peaceman coolly and kindly replied, "Well, friend, how much do you want? For I will give it to you and thus save you from the crime of committing highway robbery." Will you certainly give me what I require?" asked the robber. "Well, I will in truth if you do not require more than I've got," replied the non-resistant. Then I want 15 pounds. And the required sum was counted out to him. "Unfortunate man, I make you welcome this sum. Go home, pay your debts, hereafter get your living honestly." And at length the good preacher received a letter containing principal and interest and a humble confession of his sins from the robber, saying that his appeals waked up his slumbering conscience, which had given him no rest till he had made both restitution and confession, besides wholly changing the course of his life. So Ballou attempts to refute the idea that it is in our nature to treat one another poorly by illustrating all the ways in which we are subtly influenced by the attitudes of the people around us. He has all of these little vignettes that he gives. But another thing that he shows is just examples. He gives an example of a person who goes through life with a combative attitude. He argues that if someone with a combative personality meets another person with a combative personality, strife is sure to follow. Even people who are not usually easy to upset may be, as Ballou says, magnetized by the behavior and actions of a combative person and may be more quick to anger. But when that combative person is surrounded by people who meet combativeness with equanimity, then it's peaceful instead. It makes me think of the scene in Frances Hodgson Burnett's A Little Princess, where the youngest student at Miss Minchin's school, Lottie, is having a tantrum. And Miss Minchin, the headmistress, is very stern, tries yelling at her to stop crying immediately. And Miss Amelia Minchin, who is very sweet but not very authoritative, is vacillating between, "Oh, stop it now," and "Oh, you poor thing." And it's not until Sarah Crew comes and sits with her quietly, just experiencing life next to her, that Lottie calms down and stops acting out. Maybe if you have ever had experience with a toddler, you may be familiar with how this works. Another example Ballou gives is of the miser who keeps obsessive track of their savings and always tries to get the better of everyone in every transaction. And if a deal is the least fraction of a penny left over, tries to keep that fraction. Anyone going into a business transaction with this person will be sure to count every penny just as well and argue just as vociferously for that last half cent. On the other hand, going into a business transaction with an open-handed and fair-minded person at the other end of the deal, everyone, he says, is magnetized to be generous in turn. And a third example is someone who pridefully thinks of themselves as above everyone else, whether because of wealth or circumstances of birth or intelligence or fame or beauty. There are a number of ways that people compare themselves to others. Encountering a person who thinks of you as somehow less than may make you feel like you have something to prove, as if your human dignity cannot be recognized unless you engage in some sort of competition. And even if you cannot consider yourself to be above that person who sparked that feeling, you start treating life as a contest where you have to compete until there's some metric somehow that you can consider yourself a winner. If Adin Ballou were alive today, what would he think of social media, which seems to have been built expressly for encouraging the struggle to be seen as significant? No doubt he would have reminded us in his devoutly Christian language that we are all children of God, made in his image. Or maybe he would have turned our attention to Lady Gaga, who said in her song, Born This Way, I'm beautiful in my way because God makes no mistakes. I'm sure that each of you in your own lives can think of examples of people's behavior that spills over and influences those around them. Do you have a coworker who makes every decision into a battle? Or is there someone on your homeowners association board who's determined to carry out the highest penalty for the most minor infractions? Or is there a parent at your child or grandchild's school whose zealous protection of their own rights abrogates the rights of others? On the other hand, there may be people in your lives whose good nature seems to ripple out from them. Maybe there's a barista at Starbucks who leaves every customer with a smile, or a boss whose caring concern makes overtime feel like an adventure instead of a chore. Ballou believed that we all have the capacity to be influenced by or magnetized to those around us, and also that we have the capacity to influence others. And he was right. A recent article in Northwestern University's newsletter, Northwestern Now, spoke with Allison Skinner about research into the ways our attitudes are conveyed to and picked up on by others. So participants were watching this silent video where a group was interacting with a single person. And the group would either have friendly interactions or unfriendly interactions. And the video was edited in such a way that the individual's reaction to the group, whether the actions were friendly or unfriendly, was exactly the same. And when participants were asked later about their reaction to the individual, only 30% said the nonverbal cues of the group affected their thinking. The majority said it was, the response of the individual that caused that positive or negative association. But remember, the video of the individual was manipulated, so the individual's reaction was the same. That means that not only are we as humans wired to unconsciously conform to group behaviors, we as humans are also wired to blame the individual for the way that others treat them. How much more important does that make Ballou's argument that we must practice non-resistance? When Martin Luther King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. He was calling back to Ballou. Ballou said, evil can be overcome only with good. Faith, then, in the superiority of good over evil, truth over error, right over wrong, love over hatred, is the immediate moral basis of our doctrine. And what is the immediate moral basis of our doctrine, of the inherent worth and dignity of each person? And how does it change things when we see the world not as a battlefield of winners and losers, of those above us and those below us, but as a beloved community where we all are together and we all have space for errors and room for growth? Ballou imagined a world where people would speak in harmony, where cooler heads would prevail, and where meeting hate with love would change the world. Maybe he was a dreamer. Maybe, as he would say after Hopewell Community collapsed, times and generations are coming that will justly estimate me and my work. He might have been a dreamer, but let's hope that he's not the only dreamer. Maybe we too can work towards a day when we share with one another. Maybe we can work towards the world being as one. Thank you.
And thank you, Emily, for that wonderful talk. And now is a time in our service when we recognize and lift up to one another in love. Let us be fully present and listen with open hearts. If you wish to share a joy or sorrow now, please click on Reactions and then click Raise a Hand, and we will help you to unmute. If this is not an option for you, just wave your hand. For everyone's benefit, please be brief.
No one.
There's Mary Jane.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hold on a second, Mary Jane.
Okay.
You can unmute.
I have to love Avi's first song. I love all of the songs, but I knew who he was talking about, and that man suffered, even though he didn't protest, or he suffered by having an early death. So it was in his whole body that he felt what he had to endure.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Anybody else? If not, then whether or not you shared today for your joys, we in this community join you in celebration. For any sorrows or concerns, may you feel our sympathy and compassion. Let's pause for just a moment of gratitude, silent meditation, and prayer. And now for a closing song, Avi has selected this one from our hymnal.
Please join me in hymn number 134. Our world is one world. Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes with love or hate we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can make a different call.
Thank you, Avi. And now let us extinguish the chalice with these words. When we take fire from our chalice, it does not become less, it becomes more. And so we extinguish our chalice, but we take its light and warmth with us, multiplying their power by all of our lives and sharing it with the world. So now our service is concluded. Please feel free to stay for a very informal coffee hour. You can now unmute yourself and